gate for preservation. If the court rejected them, the artists who had kept color alive would find themselves forced into exile or ruin. Mei Lin tied a small knot in the ledger's ribbon and breathed as if to steady a bell's toll. She had done what she could, painted pieces that would speak not for rebellion but for remembrance, wrapped them in ritual cloth, and trusted them to channels that would place them before the sovereign. What remained was out of her hands. As she closed the studio door against the coming day, she felt the weight of watches and witnesses gather. The demonstration promised to answer a single, sharp question. Could craft be framed as duty rather than as danger? The answer would shape not only her fate, but the fate of a practice older than any single man's fear. Outside, beyond the palace walls, the city held its breath. Within, old edicts and new anxieties braided together like warp and weft. The hook was not dramatic in the sense of trumpets and banners. It was smaller and perhaps crueler. The court had set the demonstration for the 7th day. A day when many schedules and fates would line up in ways neither artist nor scholar could fully predict. Mei Lin packed her brushes and the ledger into a wrapped bundle and laid her forehead against the grain of the table, as if to listen for an answer the world might give her back. Somewhere in the palace a guard laughed too loudly, a dog barked, a lamp guttered. The book of old edicts lay open in the archive, a dragon's seal still waiting for a hand to lift it. The next week would take their colors further out into the clear light of court judgment. Whether that light would reveal a way to preserve color as ritual, or would strip it down to accusation and ash, was a question that crouched at the edge of all the careful work, like a crow waiting for the wind to move its prey. Mei Lin closed her eyes and, for the first time in weeks, let herself imagine the emperor pausing before a painted kite and remembering a child's name. The court that morning wore its grief like a uniform. Where once banners had announced lineage and victory in proud vermilion and lapis, now there were grey lengths of fabric folded like exhausted sails. Light limned the palace niches in a pallid way that made faces appear sleepier, as if color itself had been a stimulant and had been withdrawn. Sounds were smaller too, the click of sandals over stone, the hushed shuffle of ministers, the low, embarrassed cough of a crowd that did not know whether to be scandalized or relieved at each new turn of accusation. At the outer hall's threshold, artisans were brought forward in a procession that had the grim choreography of punishment. They wore the detritus of their labor, suit under nails, a smear of lime on a sleeve, a rope of twine around a wrist for climbing scaffolds. Their hands were those of people who had coaxed beauty out of raw things, clay, fiber, mineral, but now their skill was treated as a kind of contagion. A band of court guards, crisp in armor, framed them like sentries guarding contraband, and officials in sober robes kept lists and read passages from decrees whose language had hardened into law. Mei Lin had been awake before dawn, as she had been each morning since the rumors deepened into ordinances. She did not know whether to dress in garments that betrayed nothing of the shades she loved, or to wear something faintly familiar as a quiet talisman. In the end, she wrapped herself in a plain robe the color of washed linen, and let her hands be visible clean, ink faint. The nails free of clay, because she could not bear the thought that some clerk might see her hands and know, simply from the way she tended them, what she had been doing in secret. Her small journal lay folded within the inner folds of her robe, its pages pressed flat by the weight of recipes and fragmentary notes. She placed it where it could not be reached without her consent. When she entered the hall, it felt larger and smaller than she had imagined. The high ceiling swallowed sound. The dais where the ministers congregated was a black horizon line, a bank of severe faces. At its center, Grand Secretary Shen sat like an abacus made flesh, precise, immovable, his voice the metallic click of a counting instrument. He had arranged the affair so everything had the appearance of law and adjudication more than a purge, because removing color had become, in his telling, a matter of statecraft. To him the hues that stirred memory were a lubricant for unrest, a place where private longings pooled into public demonstrations. He had seen how festivals could turn into fires. He had seen banners become rallying cries. In his careful mind, austerity had the virtue of preventing another collapse. The artisans were made to step forward one by one and answer questions. Each testimony was a small knife turning inward. A weaver spoke of payments, and of an irregular coin given by an agent who had said nothing of source, but who had eyes like a foreign trader. A dyer who had once eked pigment from a creek bank spoke of men who came in the night and took sacks of earth, of boats that left with their cargo under tarpaulins. The interrogation wanted to map a network. Questions were cartographic: who, where, when. The answers were sketchy and laced with the terror of survival. Some confessed under the weight of threats. Some refused and were struck with a kind of social death, a branding as suspect, even if no legal mark was placed on skin. Mei Lin watched from a cushion near the center where artisans sometimes sat when proffered as witnesses. She listened to names named and then retracted, to the way a man answering for a kiln would avoid mentioning the southern mines, as if the land itself had been a protected thing. Her stomach tightened when a hand cautioned toward her an informer, perhaps, or a man whose debts had made him pliable. She had known the danger of a single misdirected word. Her life, the lives of those who transported ore and fermented dyes, could be ended by a syllable. When her name was called, she rose with the simplicity of someone who had done things that were not illegal. The hall folded inward. She walked to the raised platform. The guards had not yet placed manacles on her wrists, a courtesy of the emperor's faint fondness for artists, or perhaps a kind of indecision in the machinery of punishment. The emperor, draped where he always sat in a place of ceremony, regarded her with the blank, seeking gaze of a man who was trying to pull threads of memory out of fog. He held an embroidered cuff in his lap, given by Consort Lion, and his fingers traced its seam as if searching for a name within the stitch. Grand Secretary Shen spoke first. "Mei Lin of the Palace Studio," he said, his enunciation precise. "You are summoned for inquiry concerning the procurement and distribution of pigments declared heterodox and prohibited under imperial edict. You are accused of using these dyes in state regalia and in artworks meant to inflame private sentiment and to undermine public order." There was an arrangement in his delivery that suggested he had the gargoyle of history on his side. To accuse an artisan of inflaming sentiment was to convert the tender into a weapon. He looked at Mei Lin as if she had been a stray thread in a tapestry he was now unpicking. Mei Lin's voice, when she answered, was steadier than she felt. "I am a painter," she said. "I render what I am given to render. I know color as the difference between remembering and forgetting, but I have no place in councils of policy." Shen's mouth tightened. "Then explain why materials banned by decree appear in courtly objects. Who supplied you? Where does the ore come from? Name them." The hall felt suddenly like the kiln room at Zhao's, where the heat drove questions and alibis out of people, a place where truth sometimes came out charred and incomprehensible. Mei Lin could say she had bought from Marinaran, that she had received threads from Consort Lion, that she had been taught by Zhao. To say these names would be to offer a map to every ledger the Grand Secretary desired. To say nothing could be read as a confession by silence. She chose the third path and let her brush fill the gap where politics wanted a ledger. "I learned of pigments from women who taught me the rhythm of stone on a seaside morning," she said. "I learned that color remembers. I used what I could to restore what had been lost to disuse and to dust. I will not betray those who labored for shards of bread and kept their mouths closed to save others." A murmur moved like a current. Some in the audience breathed out in relief at her refusal to implicate merchants. Some tightened their grip on cloth or on lists. Grand Secretary Shen's face, composed until then, flashed in a muscle like a shutter. He leaned forward. "You speak in parable and you refuse to cooperate. Such refusal is obstruction in the face of sedition. It was then that scholar Lê Wei rose. He had been pressed into the day's ceremonial duties by those who still hoped words had force to bend law. He carried with him a folio of brittle records, smudged with the flaking of age, as if the past were a parchment that might turn to dust if mishandled. His defense would not be a shrill outcry of innocence, that would only inflame the ministers who saw symbols as sedition. Instead, his speech was measured. "Colleagues, we sit within an order that relies on ritual," he said, and his voice cut cleanly through the hall's hush. "We mark births and deaths, oaths and seasons, with tokens that summon memory. To strip all tokens to a single hue is to treat the people as a ledger to be balanced. Pigments like rite are tools for continuity. If we failed to preserve them, our ceremonies will be shells." He unfolded passages from an ancient treatise that spoke of ritual color as part of dynastic memory. The learned language rendered the argument less of an appeal to sentiment and more of an appeal to precedent. Lê Wei never named the southern dyes. He did not need to. He wove the notion that the court's survival depended on continuity, and that artisans were custodians of that continuity. His voice was the cool cloth that might staunch a wound. The effect was not uniform. An older minister near Shen nodded slowly, his gestures the outcome of a life that had balanced prudence and longing. But the younger secretaries shifted uneasily. Grand Secretary Shen's jaw worked. He had not been born to listen to elegies. For him, the past was a place where enemies gathered. Precedent was merely a path to be pruned. Amid the forms of law and ceremony, the emperor stirred. That small gesture had more sway than any speech. He lifted the cuff Consort Lion had given him and, with an uncertain hand, extended it toward Mai Lin. "They are painters," he said, and the words came out like a pebble falling into a deep pool. "Bring them here." The instruction was simple but powerful. Where law had the weight of precedent, the sovereign's voice had the immediate gravity of habit and affection. Some ministers shifted uneasily. Grand Secretary Shen's lips compressed. He did not shout. There were limits of decorum even in his appetite for control, but his hands moved as if to rearrange the day's narrative. To him, the emperor's favor for artists was a dangerous fluke, a private predilection that needed to be contained for the public good. Mai Lin did not collapse when the emperor said her name. The words made a small bright seam in her heart, like a color returned to a faded silk. She had not come to court for reward. She had come because something larger than her self-memory, humanity, seemed to be at stake. Still, she felt the cusp of dread tighten. The show that had begun as an inquiry was becoming a referendum. They called other witnesses, an artisan who denied knowledge and a merchant who claimed to have merely bartered for clay and cord. The questioning became a performance of law, complete with ceremonial declarations that made sin out of craft. In the margins of the room, Eunuch Rong moved like a small, dark ship. He had given her a warning earlier in the morning, a folded piece of paper that told her when she might be called, and the state of the emperor's mood. He had not been able to do much more. His office was rumor and small favors. Now he positioned himself where he might catch a look from the emperor or carry an idle phrase away to Consort Lion. When Mai Lin was dismissed back to the area for those under scrutiny, she felt the weight of eyes like dust. She sat on the cushion, and in that interval, a young artisan a few seats away began to sob. The sob was small and carried the shape of a life reduced to a ledger. Mai Lin's fingers found the hem of her robe. She had been taught to steady hands by pressing the thumb into the web of the index finger and breathing in a rhythm practiced with her grandmother. She breathed and let the pain settle into a pressure rather than a panic. Later, confined to a narrow antechamber, while the court wrestled with its own image, Mai Lin had a brief visit from Consort Lion. The consort's face was as if fabric had been watered too long, the beauty still there but softened into endurance. She pressed a piece of embroidered silk into Mai Lin's hands, an informal relic, a fragment from a place where color had once been whole. If you must go further, then do it thinking of the small things, Lion whispered. Think of the children who learn to stitch, and will not if the threads die. It was a counsel both tender and full of consequence. Mei Lin understood that any act she took would be weighed not only for its immediate outcome, but for the ripples it made in the lives of people whose art sustained more than vanity. Jiao had warned her of this when he had spoken of lives lost smuggling pigment. The memory of his confession of a village that had been depleted by extraction sat in her mouth like a bitter herb. The work of restoration could be complicit in violence. It could be rescue. She tried to make a small study on a scrap of paper in the dim light, a pair of swallows, and a ribbon of the southern blue she had reserved in the margin of her memory. Her hand moved in the rhythm of years, the arc of the wing, the hint of a throat. The blue on the edge of her brush was not mineral at that moment, but memory conjured by motion. The picture was small and private, a tiny chapel to what she feared losing. A footfall at the door made her close the folio. Eunuch Rong entered with his careful, hushed bearing. They debate, he said in a voice remade small to fit the room. You will likely be required again. The Grand Secretary pushes for a public demonstration of danger so that he may appear decisive and just. There are fears, and those fears find a shape in color. Mei Lin looked at him. Will you tell Consort Lion that I do not betray names? She asked. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. I will tell the court only what it needs, and I will carry small truths to those who can hold them. But there are limits. The Emperor's word may yet tilt the balance. They left her with a small, pragmatic kindness, a bowl of cooled tea and a sliver of preserved ginger wrapped in paper, things that tasted of earth and of long voyages. She ate slowly, feeling the root's spice ricochet against the cold of her resolve. By dusk the hall's debates had not resolved. Fingers were still being waved at maps and ledgers. The Grand Secretary tightened his lines. Scholar Lai Wei persisted in calling for remembrance as policy. The Emperor dozed, then started, then called out for a poem another minister offered up in truncated lines. The spectacle had done its work. It had turned a question of craft into a question of allegiance. Those who benefited from austerity were sharpening their case. Those who feared total erasure found their voices taking a warmer color. Mei Lin was allowed to return to a temporary lodging within the palace confines, rather than be taken to a cell that night. The mercy was hollow and sharp. It meant she was under watch, that freedom was a careful thing measured by a string. She unrolled her small sketchbook, and with hands that had steadied through years of grinding and rinsing, she penned recipes in shortened grains of mineral weighed against tears of water, volumes of rice paste, the time when a ferment needed to breathe. She wrote not to hoard, but to ensure that if her voice were stilled, the knowledge could be pieced together again by those who knew the language of stone and sea. As night settled over the palace, the lamps in the inner courtyard burned with a quiet that suggested waiting. The day had been a tribunal in which beauty had been tried for its alleged crimes. The verdict was not yet cast, but Mei Lin felt the string pull taut. To preserve the network's secrecy, she had withheld names. To preserve human lives, perhaps that withholding would be an anchor that would sink her. She lay awake remembering the rhythm of her grandmother's hands on the stone and the sound of the sea that had taught her the first temper of color. When she finally slept, it was a thin sleep, threaded with images of the trial, the flaring light in the hall, Li Wei's measured voice, the Emperor's uncertain request that had dressed her in favor for a sliver of time. She woke with the impression of being sanded down and newly shaped, no longer merely a painter, but a thing pressed into service by history's friction. Outside, in the courtyard, a guard's shadow moved like a slow tide. The morning would bring more forms, more evidence, and perhaps a sentence that would set the arc of the palace's culture for years. Mei Lin rose and set a small study in a place where Consort Lion might find it if she were permitted to visit the last private offering she could make to a man who sometimes remembered what color meant. As dawn lightened the pale banners to the whisper of gray, she made a decision, whatever came. She would not turn the names of the poor and the hidden into coin for the court's peace. If the network must be scattered to survive, she would scatter it with her hands rather than trade lives for leniency. The trial had begun to shape the world's terms. By the time the day closed, she knew those terms might demand a sacrifice. She had made her choice, and the rest of the court would have to account for it. The hook of the morning was a single, small tremor. A messenger had arrived from the southern ports, with a rumor that a courier had been captured farther than expected. The news traveled like a thread pulled taut, and with it, a shadow of exposure. For Mei Lin, the day's trial had not only begun. It had set in motion a spool of consequences whose end none of them could yet see. She smoothed the sketch she had painted, slipping it into the folds of her robe, and stepped toward the chamber where law would again try to weigh the worth of color against the fear of disorder. When the doors opened, the court was ready to turn another page. The question now was whether the book would be read as a liturgy of preservation or as a chronicle of punishment. Mei Lin went forward, not with the swagger of a zealot, but with the quiet of a woman whose hand held a compass no ledger could unmake. The sentence had not been spoken. The world had not yet been decided, but the first legal clack had fallen, and the echo would not be undone. The cell was colder than Mei Lin had expected, but cold had the odd gift of sharpening color. In the faint light that slipped between the wooden bars, pigments seemed to behave like old friends who had shrunk into smaller rooms measured, restrained, but still there. Mei Lin sat on the woven mat with her journal open on her knees, the paper a pale pond into which she could drop the ink of memory. Outside, the palace breathed on its slow, ceremonial schedule. Footsteps that once carried the population of a court now echoed in rhythms of fewer people, each step a thrift. At intervals the distant clang of a bell proclaimed an hour, and the familiar sound tightened the walls of her cell into a clock. She had been given a corner near the imperial cloister, a place the administration claimed was convenient for observation, and which the prosecution had argued was more than convenient enough to keep a suspected heterodox artisan from escape. It felt like both mercy and punishment, close enough to hear the court's small life and far enough from its corridors to be silenced. Mei Lin's hands still remembered how to work. Though she had been spared brush and table for days, her fingers had not forgotten the minute pressure that coaxed a stroke into life. She placed the tip of a reed pen on the paper and wrote, slow and careful. The lines were not merely notes but incantations, a methodical listing of colors she had used in recent clandestine works, granules ground with rice. The ratio of water to fermented root, the warmth necessary to coax an inherited blue from a lump of stone. For each recipe she wrote a memory that acted as the binder, a grandmother's song for the tempering of indigo. The smell of seaweed drying on a rack for the mordant for a certain green. The taste of ginger in Jiao's parcel for the way southern lapis would bloom when warmed by careful hands. She had learned that memory was a better vessel than parchment when parchment could be seized, and so she soaked her brain with detail until it was a miniature kiln. She drew a small square at the top of a page and, by touch, traced a circle the size of the swatch Jiao had sent. She could not yet open it. Visiting hours were short, and any object might be confiscated. Instead, she used a corner of her sleeve to smudge the page where a blue would go, letting the cloth leave a ghost of color on the sheet. It was not the pigment itself, but the gesture of it that steadied her like an offering. The first visitor arrived when the cloister bell tolled the hour after dusk. Eunuch Rong passed through with a linen bundle and a face that had been taught 1,000 masks for court life, inscrutable, obliging, faintly wary. When he saw the small, cramped room, his professional neutrality softened. He set the bundle down on the mat, as if laying a feral bird into gentler hands. Short time, he said, voice lowered to a tone meant not to be overheard even in a cell. "It is only bread and tea, and news if you wish." Mei Lin bowed slightly in acknowledgement. She had precious little to say that would not inflame suspicion, and yet she wanted to ask about the emperor. Did he cough less? Had he smiled? Instead, she accepted the sipped tea and permitted herself to taste a sweetness like a memory she could not name. Rong remained by the doorway, shifting from foot to foot in that way courtiers do when they hold a secret heavier than their loyalty. "There are murmurs," he offered finally, and the word felt like a bell inside her chest. "Some ministers speak of mercy. There are men who remember music. But others Shen keeps men who agree with him," Mei Lin said. She had few illusions, and the more the court divides, the less room for small things like fragile pigments. Rong made a noise that could have been a laugh or a sigh. "I have been told to watch the walls. I have been told nothing about your fate. But I will tell you this, they carry the emperor's folded robe for inspection each morning, and he reaches for corners he cannot find. For 3 mornings there has been a splash of vermilion sewn into one cuff that he touches, as if it anchors him. Something in the eye lingers still." Even as Rong spoke, Mei Lin could imagine the action, an emperor's finger feeling the heat of red silk and catching like a string that tethers a mind. The image trembled in the room like a moth. When he left, Rong bowed and folded both hands. "Be careful with hope," he said, as if hope were a fragile object too. "Hope can be used against you." After he departed, the cell swallowed itself again into a small dark. Mei Lin opened her journal and drew a line beneath the square she had smudged earlier, writing in small, clear characters about the mordant used in the last repairs she had made to the emperor's sleeve. Each notation was anchored to a memory, a laugh, an old poem, an afternoon in the southern bay where her grandmother had taught her the rhythm of stone against ore. By committing them, Mei Lin made them more than private knowledge. She made them portable. Consort Lion came next, her arrival announced not by eunuch page, but by a sound like fabric folding around a secret. Where Rong carried practicality, Lion brought intimacy. She entered with the practiced discretion of one who had learned to see through the court's layers, and to gather what comfort she could. Mei Lin had not expected to see such a presence so soon. Lion's visits were letters of the court's interior life. The consort sat cross-legged opposite Mei Lin and unfolded a small chest wrapped in camphor paper. The smell of camphor and silk rose like the memory of summer altars. Consort Lion's fingers moved with the tenderness of needlework as she took out remnants, a cuff edge embroidered with phoenix feathers whose gold had dulled, a square of crimson ribbon whose tone still warmed the palm, a length of thread that had been hidden in the hem of a gown. "I keep them in a place where no one expects," Lion said, voice low. "They are not grand enough for court display, and are too dear for my own vanity. They are for remembering." Mei Lin reached and touched the ribbon. It was thinner and softer than the banners sold by merchants, but when she pressed it to her cheek the color seemed to hum like a string struck on a guikin. Lion watched her with an expression at once wry and wistful. He loved certain reds, the consort said. Not the shout of vermilion that announcements use, but a softened heart red, the kind you find in an elder's cheek when they recall a first child. "I thought you should see it." Mei Lin closed her hand around the thread as if anchoring herself. For a moment, the cell was full of tiny domestic histories, times when the emperor had laughed, the cadence of a poem, the way a palace gossip could once turn a room bright. Lion's presence was a small rebellion against the erasures the Grand Secretary demanded. "They ask for lists," Lion murmured after a pause, "and I offer memories. It has not persuaded them." "But if you can offer," she faltered, then set another thing on Mei Lin's knees. A folded scrap of silk with an embroidered rose so faint it looked like it had been weathered by rain. Mei Lin inhaled. Somewhere beyond the thin wall the palace clock struck. "This cannot be used in evidence," she said, though she meant it to the world and not the object. Consort Lion smiled slightly and leaned in so that her hair brushed Mei Lin's arm.